I knew from the moment that I picked up my first fantasy book that fantasy was the genre for me. I grew up reading fantasy. I read it literally back to back, and it's very much a comfort genre for me, but it made me realize that everyone has their own specific genre that they are in love with. It kind of made me intrigued to find out what are other people's favorite genres. So if you're watching this video, please let me know down below in the comments, what is your favorite genre, the genre that you read the most, and why and how did you fall in love with it? Was it the nostalgia, the writing, the topics within them? Because I find it genuinely so interesting that I lean towards fantasy, but I know other people who like reading romance and other people who like reading lit fic, and I'm just wondering, what is it about that certain genre that kind of clicks with your head? Now, I grew up reading fantasy, as I mentioned before, and I think as a young child, fantasy was the genre that interested me. As a young child, I wasn't really interested in historical fiction or contemporary because I found those genres, if I'm being honest, really boring, and fantasy introduced me to this whole new vast world with these different magic systems, with these different characters and I guess tropes. Recently, I have been trying to go out of my comfort zone, but I kind of realized that a lot of the times the only reason why I would go out of my comfort zone is actually because of other videos, to film these specific videos where I try to read books from other genres. But in my own personal time, whenever I pick up a book that I'm interested in, it's never a book that's in another genre. It has always been a fantasy book. When making those videos, I've actually kind of realized why I don't really like these other genres, which I wanted to talk about today, my thoughts on these other genres and why I personally don't like them. And because of this, I'm interested to hear why other people like these specific genres and kind of just compare. And I don't know if it's because I grew up reading fantasy, if I got into reading recently, and if the first genre that I was introduced to, for example, was lit fic, would lit fic then be my favorite genre? Or would it then change to fantasy if I got introduced to fantasy? For me, a big part is definitely because of the nostalgic factor. I kind of know how fantasy books are somewhat gonna go. I know about the tropes and I'm interested in the different world building, whereas with other genres, yeah, sometimes I'm not super interested in the topics within them, which is why I don't tend to pick them up. But going into these specific genres and why I personally don't really like them, and I just want to point out that this is all my personal opinions. Of course, I don't hate these genres, just want to make that clear, but definitely there are reasons why I just don't like reading books within these genres. Talking about mystery and thrillers, I do find them fun and entertaining, but I am the type of person who honestly cannot handle suspense, and I cannot handle slow, boring plots. My issue with mystery and thrillers is that sometimes they can be so thick when honestly it could just be an 100-page book and I would be happy. I want to know what the mystery is, what the shocking revelation is. I am invested in that whole idea, but I'm not invested in all of the fluff that leads up to that. Honestly, I could read maybe a couple of chapters of the book to gain the context and then just skip ahead to the whole ending and I would still be like, oh my gosh. But I just feel so bored because it feels like this repetitive cycle of the author trying to build up the suspense, which they do a good job of. But I just want the story to move quickly, and it's so slow because most of the time they do have to extend the book to make it 300 to 400 pages. And a lot of the mystery books that I have read, I just haven't being interested in them, and going into a book with the expectation that, oh, there's gonna be a huge twist, I think also makes the book less interesting because you know what to expect. You just don't know exactly what's gonna happen in the plot, but you know that something is gonna come out and that something is going to be surprising. A good example is Five Survive by Holly Jackson, which I read recently, and Holly Jackson, her books are so interesting, and I think this is also the reason why I don't like mystery thrillers sometimes, is because they're so illogical, which it's fictional, okay, so anything can happen in a fictional book, but sometimes it just doesn't click with me, the whole idea of this mystery, because at this point authors, they really need to make things up because there are so many mystery thriller books out there that it honestly isn't exciting unless you have a super wild plot. So Five Survive is about 6 teenagers, young adults who go on this RV camping trip. They end up being trapped with this sharpshooter who is keeping them within this area, and he is trying to push one of them to reveal the secret, and if they don't reveal the secret, then everybody is gonna get killed. The whole entire time I'm like, ooh, secret, I want to know what the secret is. But then the whole entire book was just this cycle of them trying to escape the RV, and it felt like we were going nowhere. And Oliver, if you've read the book, he's the most annoyingest character that I've ever read. He just kept yapping his mouth and I wanted him to shut up, honestly. But there was this whole slow build up and this vague connection to, I guess, the main character's mom and how she played part in the story. I got 70% into the book, and at that point it was 12 o'clock. I literally stayed up to read it because I was gonna look ahead to the ending, but I was like, no, I gotta like slowly read it because that's the whole point of reading a mystery book, right? I read 70% of it and then I was just tired because I want to know what the secret is. Nobody's talking about the secret. So then I just decided, you know what, I'm gonna look ahead. And then I read the whole revelation, and yeah, it was a shocking plot twist. But at the same time, because of the whole build up, at that point, I just don't really care about the story anymore. And I feel like if the book was 100 pages, I would have liked it even more. But my issue with this book in particular is the fact that it's not believable at all that this is a whole plot. And this is what I'm saying, they need to create new ideas for this genre, but I don't know if I prefer actual, like, I don't know if I want to say like murder cases, that type of mystery, compared to like a mystery thriller book that has paranormal aspects of it, if that makes sense. But this book in particular was weird because I read the revelation and then I was like, like, I don't really know how I feel about this whole mystery. I'm the type of person who honestly needs to know what happens in the end. Sometimes with books, I do like jumping forward and reading the ending to see if it's a good ending or not. And yeah, I do like spoiling myself, so I am part of the issue. But definitely with me, the reason why I'm not super into mystery and thrillers is because most of the time I do find them very boring, slow, repetitive. Honestly, I don't even like the way that the characters are written sometimes, and then sometimes they have this weird romance thing going on, and I'm like, come on, we do not need romance in a mystery book. You do not need to include romance in a mystery book. It's fishy as well because now that person is suspicious and I cannot trust anyone in this book, even the main character. Of course, it could always just be that because I haven't explored the genre even further. You know, I haven't really found super good books. I have read thriller mystery books that I've really enjoyed, but I've also read some that I don't enjoy, and I think part of it is because a lot of the popular thriller books I've picked up and then I was like, this one ain't that good. I wanted to talk about contemporary romance, which I'm just gonna clump these genres together. I consider romance to be romance. Basically, the whole book is focused on the chemistry between these two characters. There's nothing else about it. And contemporary is more like a mixture. So we focus on the romance, but it's more of, I don't know if I would consider it like a subplot, but we also focus on the main character's life and their, I guess, struggles with work or family or etc. I would say romance and contemporary is more of a palette cleanser. It's something where you go into the story with this certain expectation. For example, with romance, you know the certain tropes and the way that romance books are gonna be written, so in some sort of way that is comforting. I personally cannot read like 10 romance books back to back because at that point I would just be tired because I know what's going to happen. A lot of romance books as well, the way that they are written just doesn't really suit my taste, and again, this is probably because of the romance books that I pick up, but I just think it's not a genre that really interests me. I do read it from time to time if I want something a little bit more simple. Recently though, I have read a couple of contemporary books, which is actually for a video, and I read these books willingly, if that makes sense. Like, I wanted to read it because it was new releases from authors that I've read before, and I think these books kind of made me crash out and made me realize why I don't like contemporary romance that much either. And a big part of it is because there are specific tropes that are used within them that are always the same, and it's always the main character has issues with work, they have issues with their parents. The female lead is always, in a way, like insecure, has issues with her relationships. The male lead always falls first, and both the characters are like super attractive, and there's a whole emphasis. There's also usually insta love. You see, I'm listing all these things, and you know when you go into a contemporary book that there's gonna be that, especially because these contemporary romance books are usually standalones. There's not that much space for you to develop a very slow burn relationship in a 300-page book, which is why they usually happen really quickly and why insta love is included a lot. Maybe that's why I kind of get caught off guard when there is this sort of insta attraction between the two characters, but I do understand why they do it, because as I mentioned, they don't have a lot of time to develop this relationship. I just think there's not that much you can write in a contemporary or romance world, and at this stage in my life I'm not super interested in reading about the struggles of the female lead and the issues they have with work and, you know, their family and their parents. I'm kind of in the in between, like I'm a young adult. I'm not in the stage where I can kind of relate to the characters in these contemporary worlds. I don't know, it's just like, what's the point of me reading a contemporary book when I feel like I cannot personally get anything out of it? Going onto lit fic and historical fiction, honestly, historical fiction just kind of bores me, but at the same time, if it's about war, I don't want to read about war because it makes me cry. I read The Woman in the beginning of the year, and litfic is another genre which kind of frustrates me. It's fun sometimes. I love reading about adult dramas and the things that they go through, but a lot of litfic books that I've read, I also didn't like them. I would read them, but then when I finish them, I would be like, I don't think that this book is for me, and oftentimes they just left me kind of frustrated. And I know that I'm not super into these genres because whenever I pick them up, I just honestly don't want to read them, and that's kind of the biggest sign for me going into other genres, because there are so many other genres that I can't talk about all of them. I wanted to get into why I like reading fantasy, and as I mentioned before, a huge part of it is definitely nostalgia and the fact that I grew up reading fantasy. But what I find so interesting is that fantasy is such a vast genre compared to all the other genres that I mentioned before. For example, with fantasy, it can be a mixture of historical, sci-fi, dystopian. You can even have like urban fantasy, which is basically set in the modern contemporary world, except there is magical aspects within them. For example, Percy Jackson is urban fantasy, the Mortal Instruments. Then we have high fantasy, low fantasy, which, if I'm being honest, I don't really know the difference between them. And then, as I mentioned, we have fantasy that is mixed with other stuff. So I personally like reading fantasy, and I like reading fantasy when it's mixed with other genres. And I think that's why I like the genre, because each book that you read is going to be so different, because a romance book is just a romance book, but a fantasy book with romance in it is completely different. And of course, there's going to be really bad fantasy books, like always, like it is in all these other genres as well. But there are also so many great fantasy books, and I think a huge part of it as well is because a lot of fantasy books tends to be part of a big series, and through that you can see the development and the growth of the characters, especially if you grew up with them. For example, Percy Jackson is actually the book that introduced me to the world of reading, that made me really fall in love with it. Growing up while reading Percy Jackson, I literally grew up with, you know, the characters. Actually, not really, because I'm pretty sure all of the Olympians was out, but Heroes of Olympus, I basically grew up with that storyline and I'm waiting for those books to come out, which was so exciting. But being introduced to that world and these characters and seeing how they grew up over time and how the relationships in terms of like romance and like best friends, platonic relationships, it just makes you feel a lot closer to the characters, especially because the world as well is able to develop. Referring to the Mortal Instruments as well, the Shadowhunters world in general is honestly so vast, and there may be a lot of plot holes within them, but I love being introduced to the different characters and learning more about the world and the interconnection of the characters and the timelines and everything. So a big part of it is definitely because fantasy has the opportunity to really develop the characters and to create this nostalgia because you are with them for a longer time and you form this certain attachment with them. Most of the times, if I read a standalone, that's it for me. Like, I honestly will read a standalone and I won't care about it anymore. But if I read a series, for example, I do tend to like series more, and in the future, most of the time, I only really reread series, which I kind of just realized right now. I don't really reread a lot of standalones, which is quite interesting. And I love being reintroduced to this new world and watching everything unfold again. And it's just exciting because each book has, you know, a different plot. It's a continuation of a plot that happened in the first book. And seeing how these plots in the world building evolve throughout the series, it's just so exciting to read. And although fantasy books obviously have the same tropes within them, they do feel so different from each other. You really don't know what to expect within them. As I mentioned with contemporary books, I've kind of pinpointed some things that I know is going to happen. Same with romance books, same with mystery books, if I'm being honest. But when I go into a fantasy book, honestly, I don't know what's going to happen because each fantasy book is so vastly different, especially if it's a fantasy mixed with sci-fi, for example. A fantasy mixed with sci-fi is going to be completely different to urban fantasy. Urban fantasy is going to be completely different to a dystopian fantasy. That's the reason why I'm so enraptured with the genre, and looking at my TBR list, it really only is fantasy books. Even looking at my shelf, a majority of them are fantasy series. This is the reason why I like fantasy books and why I'm not super interested in other genres, unfortunately. I would love to know what your guys' favorite genres are and the reason why you fell in love with them, and maybe some recommendations of your favorite books within that certain genre. Thank you guys for listening to this discussion, this little rant, and I will see you guys in another video. Bye!